To survive in a constantly changing environment, an organism has to solve a rigid information processing problem. It must detect external inputs, which biologists call stimuli, and generate precise targeted outputs, or responses. The biological hardware available to execute these responses varies wildly depending on the organism. A mammal has a central brain and complex muscle fibers, while a plant has neither. This diagram illustrates two distinct ways life solves this problem. On the left is a high-speed, localized electrical routing network. On the right, a slow-spreading chemical diffusion gradient. We are going to deconstruct the three primary architectures of biological control: centralized neural networks, localized phytohormonal gradients, and systemic biochemical broadcasting. Ultimately, biological survival requires matching the correct architectural speed and scale to the specific environmental threat. When an animal encounters a sudden, dangerous stimulus, it needs an immediate, targeted physical response. The primary solution for this is the bioelectrical grid, better known as the nervous system. This 3D schematic shows the base unit of transmission in this grid, the nerve cell, or neuron. Information flows directionally. Sensory inputs are detected by branch-like structures called dendrites, converted into electrical impulses, and routed straight down the length of the cell to the axon terminal. But there is a critical mechanical bottleneck in this grid. Neurons do not physically touch. There is a microscopic gap between the nerve endings of one cell and the dendrites of the next, called a synapse. To cross this physical break, the electrical impulse undergoes a phase change. It converts into a chemical signal, specifically a gas, that diffuses across the gap. Once these particles contact the adjacent dendrites, they immediately trigger a new electrical pulse. Zooming out to the macro network, specialized sensory neurons act as the intake layer, carrying data from the sense organs directly to the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord. Under normal conditions, data follows a long pathway. The sensory signal routes up the spinal cord and into the forebrain. Here, the brain analyzes the data against stored information, generates a decision, and sends a command back down to specific voluntary muscles. But this topographical map shows the trajectory of an emergency override, the short pathway, or reflex arc. Look at how this incoming sensory signal routes to the spinal cord and loops straight back out, completely bypassing the brain. By processing the input locally at the spinal cord, the system fires a motor output back to the surrounding muscles. This minimizes the physical travel distance of the signal, eliminating processing latency. If you touch an intensely hot object, your hand pulls away before the heavy processing centers in your brain even register the sensation of pain. The bioelectrical network sacrifices total body reach in exchange for absolute localized velocity, reacting fast enough to prevent immediate structural damage to tissue. Now consider organisms completely lacking central processing, neural tissues, or musculature. How do they generate a targeted output? Plants execute responses through structural manipulation. Instead of contracting muscles, they move by initiating localized cellular growth or changing cell shapes in specific directions, a mechanism known as tropism. This cross-section diagram shows a plant shoot tip experiencing phototropism, growth directed toward light. Notice the incoming directional vectors representing sunlight striking only one side of the cellular structure. The plant drives this movement using a specialized phytohormone called auxin. As light hits one side, auxin molecules actively migrate and concentrate heavily on the shaded opposite side of the stem. This high concentration of auxin forces these shaded cells to grow longer. Because the cells on the sunlit side remain their normal size, this elongation creates asymmetrical torque, physically bending the entire stem toward the light. Plants deploy an entire catalog of these chemical actuators. Gibberellins drive stem and root elongation, while cytokinins force rapid cell division to expand the mass of developing fruits. Conversely, they use systemic growth inhibitors to manage resource allocation. Abscisic acid triggers the wilting and detachment of old leaves, and ethylene gas initiates the ripening of fully grown fruit. Lacking a high-speed bioelectrical grid, plants substitute rapid motion with permanent structural adaptation, driven entirely by precisely controlled chemical gradients. While the animal bioelectrical grid is incredibly fast, it has an inherent limitation. Electrical impulses are transient, and nerve endings cannot physically wire into every single cell in a large organism. To coordinate global metabolic states, animals rely on a secondary architecture. This map shows the human circulatory system overlaid with key endocrine glands, which solve for scale by broadcasting chemical signals, or hormones, directly into the bloodstream. We can observe how this works during a severe systemic threat, like a predator attack. This triggers the fight or flight protocol. The localized nervous system detects the threat first, but it takes the adrenal glands, located just above the kidneys, to execute a systemic metabolic override by flooding the global bloodstream with adrenaline. Adrenaline is broadcast everywhere, but it operates on target tissue specificity. It passes freely through organs like the stomach, but locks specifically into receptors on the heart, lungs, and skeletal muscles. Once bound to these receptors, the hormone forces immediate physiological shifts. The heart rate accelerates, blood vessels divert flow away from the skin, and the diaphragm increases its muscular movements to boost breathing. The ultimate purpose of this override is singular: to flood skeletal muscles with the massive surplus of oxygen and glucose required to sustain intense physical output. Biochemical broadcasting trades the localized millisecond speed of a reflex arc for total body synchronization. Look at this tripartite dashboard comparing latency timescales. A neural reflex arc operates in milliseconds. An endocrine broadcast circulates in minutes. A plant's structural tropism takes days. Each architecture operates on a vastly different timeline. Complex animals require both their high-speed neural networks and their slower endocrine broadcasts to run simultaneously in perfectly calibrated equilibrium. When this equilibrium breaks, we see the pathology of systemic failure. If an animal lacks dietary iodine, the thyroid gland cannot produce thyroxine. Without thyroxine, the organism's ability to metabolize carbohydrates and fats breaks down, causing severe growth and energy deficits. Similarly, if the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas malfunction, the body loses its ability to regulate blood sugar, resulting in the condition known as diabetes. Whether it is a rapid bioelectrical short circuit pulling a hand away from a fire, or a slow accumulation of oxen driving a stem toward the sun, biological coordination is an intricately optimized feat of systems engineering.